I'd say overall, there is still a lot of enthusiasm for globalism, right? So by globalism, I just mean this sort of borderless, like at least intellectual capital flow, and this belief that that sort of interaction and openness is what's going to push the human race forward.
Welcome to another episode of Chinatown 2.0, an interview podcast about the stories, ideas, and actions of Chinese diaspora individuals. I'm your host, Richard Yan. Today I interviewed Ma Rui, an investment banker turned venture capitalist turned podcaster. She grew up in underdeveloped rural China, moved to the US for education, returned to China and spent a lot of time in local tech scenes, and eventually moved to Silicon Valley. She now works as a podcaster that explains China's big tech, such as Alibaba, Huawei, Tencent, and ByteDance, to a Western audience. We talked about the implications of the recent TikTok ban, the general negative consequences with the Sino-US decoupling, comparisons of life in the two countries as a Chinese diaspora and as a Chinese woman, and how she's enjoying her role as a bridge between two worlds as a podcaster. Rui's podcast is Tech Buzz China. Apparently, investors of Chinese tech stocks found her program so educational and enlightening that they had her organize an offline tour of the major China big techs, which created an interesting business for her, at least before 2020. As usual, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the YouTube bell, and write us a review on your podcast platform. Thank you. Hope you enjoy this episode. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we're live. Hey, Rui. How are you?
Hi. Hey, Richard. I'm good.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? How are you making a living? And what are you most excited about these days?
Yeah, I can tell you how I'm making a living right now, which is I'm not making a living pretty much.
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
doing a podcast called Tech Buzz China, this background here, which is on China tech, and also blog a little bit through my newly started newsletter. Last year, we were able to take investors to China because we focus on large cap companies and very large Chinese tech startups. And that was a good revenue source. But unfortunately, because of the pandemic, in this case, I'm supplementing my income with just consulting funds and startups. So we'll see. That's just started, and we'll see how that goes. Good question on my background. I can give my background. I think without, I guess, taking a super long time, maybe I'll just highlight some things that might be relevant to people watching. Is
Sure.
that I was born in China. I was born in, however, rural China. So unlike a lot of, I think, immigrants that you might meet my age, I'm 39, who came to the US when they were kids, I'm not from Beijing, Shanghai. I'm from ostensibly the city of Xi'an, which is in the middle of China, but I was not born in the city. I was born very far outside of the city. And that's because I grew up sort of in the countryside, with my grandparents. And I grew up, they worked for a, let's call it sort of like factory type situation. And so we sort of lived in a commune-ish place, right? Where basically the community was the factory and everyone who worked for it and all the family members. And we were just isolated from everything else. And then outside of the walls, it was just farmland. So that's where I grew up in China, very different from, I think, most other people I've spoken to. And then I immigrated here with my parents. I came here in 1989 in October, in case people are curious when. My parents were already here for graduate school, and I came and joined them. Obviously, I was 8, didn't know what the heck was going on. And we lived in South Carolina for 2 years. And then thereafter,
You were 8 at the time then?
I was 8, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So I went to school a little early when I was in China. So I was already in 3rd grade, and I started 4th grade right when I arrived here. And then after, I guess not quite 2 years, we moved to California, to Northern California, because my parents are both engineers. So my dad finished grad school, and he basically was like, I'm going to Silicon Valley because that's where all the tech jobs are. Just moved moved our family across the country. And I consider myself actually as having mostly grown up in Northern California. So, which is where I reside today, where my parents are still at today. My grandparents are also here. cousins, aunt, etc. So my whole family is really in Northern California, which is why when I moved to China in 2007, after graduating from college and after working for a few years here in Silicon Valley, I would tell everyone that I'm Californian. So when
Right
I
on.
arrived in China, people are like, "Where are you from?" I'm like, "California." So
Yeah.
really have a huge part of that as my identity, especially Northern California. And I happened to work in China for 8 years because I first went because my fiance at the time moved. So I had honestly, no personal interest in going. And then I arrived there and then got laid off. So had to stay because it was the middle of the great financial crisis.
It
So
was, yes.
there were no jobs in the US. And I was in financial services. I did investment banking. So it was just like, okay, might as well just stay in China and see if I can find something. I also had a mortgage at this point.
Yeah.
And so
This was at
stayed
Morgan
in
Stanley?
China. Yeah, so I
Was this
was at
Morgan Stanley?
Morgan
Okay.
Stanley. Yeah, I was at
Yep,
Morgan
yep.
Stanley. And then like basically I ended up just staying for 8 years with no particular plan. Um, was when I arrived there, because I was just following my fiance, I had to put up with whatever job was, closest to him because he was in Shanghai at the time. The job was real estate investing, which was really interesting, but was not my cup of tea. Didn't really like it. So I gradually moved away from real estate and more back into tech. So that then I did media and sort of new media after that at a merchant bank. And then after that, I moved on into venture, just focusing straight up only on tech as part of 500 Startups, which is a global early stage seed fund. And did that for a couple years before I moved back to the US, back to where my family is now at the end of 2015. And I also moved back for no real good reason. Everyone's like, "Why did you move back? Oh, you were doing so well there." I moved back because personal reasons. Again, the person I was dating at the time. I think you can hear a familiar refrain here.
I can, yeah.
Yes, moved. We met in Asia, and then he moved here, and I was like, "Well, that's where my family is. Maybe I should just go back." So I went back. So so I'm in this interesting situation where I did have a childhood in China, but it's sort of like I would call it like sort of communist China or very rural China, right? Very, very different from urban China, where I think you grew up. And
I
then,
did, yeah.
and then I also have this odd situation where for almost half of my professional career, I was in China. Maybe arguably some of the most productive years of my professional career, I was in China, and I was able to work across different industries. Most tech people don't really get to touch real estate, which is extremely traditional, very, very different. And most tech people don't get to touch a traditional media, right? So when I was at the media firm, I would talk to like radio companies, music festivals, film companies, et cetera. And these are very, very different businesses from technology. And I feel like that gave me a really different experience.
Diverse perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah. That was a long answer, I guess, but I
Oh,
was
that's
trying to
great.
highlight some experiences that don't usually come out when I introduce myself, because then it's usually like, yeah, I worked for 15 years in investment banking, private equity, venture capital.
Right, right, right. But it
Yeah.
sounds like it's not just the spectrum of professional exposures you've had, but also maybe diversity of life experiences. Like you said, you were raised in, communist slash rural China, and then you
Yeah.
came
Rural
here,
China. Yeah.
South Carolina, and then NorCal, and then went back to China. And at that point, China was obviously extremely different, and you were also in urban China, and now you're back, and now China and US have kind of shut their borders with each other. I mean, it's just the world has changed so much, along with your journey. So, what are you most excited about these days? What's occupying your mind space?
I'm excited about various different things. I have a lot of,
Oh, I want to hear all of them.
I have a wide area of interests. I consider myself quite multidisciplinary. So I went and I did my undergrad in EECS, not because I loved electrical engineering, computer science, but because my parents were both engineers and I just had no idea what I wanted to do. Afterwards, I realized that I didn't want to do that, so did banking, got an
Right.
EMBA actually, but I also felt like I had interest in education and psychology, so I went and got graduate degrees in those as well. And so I've been in school for a very long time in addition to working.
Yeah.
And I think that
Right.
I'm really interested in still, like, obviously primarily technology, but how we leverage insights from other fields to better specifically our education and mental well-being. So those are two fields I'm really interested in. I should say that because of the rising US-China tensions, I have been personally, at least in the last couple months, spending more time on this particular area, which is, I think, how we got connected, because you saw that I was probably just quite active on Twitter about this stuff. And that's
Yeah.
just because, I'm personally very passionate about exactly what you said earlier, right? Sort of like the globalism that was widely available, the openness that was widely available when I was growing up and when I was working, when I was starting my career. And I took it like completely for granted because I had no idea it could be any other way. And
Right.
now that, I'm married and, wanting to have children, I sort of want to make sure that that openness still exists um, for the next generation. So that's become like quite a personal passion of mine. And especially because I'm committed to Silicon Valley as my community, I feel a little bit of a responsibility, I guess, as a bicultural, bilingual translator of
Yeah.
of the like
The
you call it, but
bridge,
yeah, the
the
bridge that in between the you
connector.
know yeah.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some hot button topics of the day. And
Okay.
so you obviously know a lot about TikTok. You tweet a lot about it. You probably come in contact with people that are either fervent users or, you know, people that have worked for the company, I'm assuming. So are you able to just give us a quick background on why the US took the action that it did and issued an executive order to ban TikTok, and why now in particular? And then if you can talk through, say, the reaction from ByteDance and Chinese people and American people, that would be helpful as well.
Sure. It's I wouldn't say I'm a TikTok expert. I would say that overall I'm more of a ByteDance expert. I don't even want to use the word expert, but I guess I've probably spent a lot more time studying this company than many other people, and that's just primarily because a couple months ago I was like, oh, pandemic, can't take my investors to China. What can I do this summer? I might as well write about a company that I find interesting. And that company was ByteDance. So I
Right.
thought I would write a short ebook about it. And then little did I know it would blow up to be the, international situation it is today.
Right on.
So I didn't actually focus on TikTok, but I, started, I guess, a couple months ago, started talking to ex-employees and current employees at ByteDance, trying to understand the company better. And of course, TikTok is a big portion of that story, but actually not that big, because there's far more people working on other products within ByteDance that generate far more revenue. That being said, the TikTok phenomenon
Oh,
is
and by
mainly
the way, before you
Mhm.
jump into TikTok,
Yeah.
though, are you able to share what these other revenue lines are? For some of our listeners, all they have heard of is just TikTok. And for me, the only other thing I know about is Toutiao, and that's it. And I'm really curious what
Okay.
other things people are working on at ByteDance and, how much revenue they're generating and so forth.
Sure. I mean, it's still primarily Toutiao and Douyin, right? So for those of you who aren't aware, TikTok is actually the international version of
Right.
a domestic Chinese app called Douyin, which means vibrato. But but in the press, I do have to agree, and the company doesn't do a good job delineating the difference sometimes, because when you see like App Store downloads, sometimes depending on who it is, they don't necessarily differentiate between TikTok and Douyin. So a lot of times some metrics are merged together.
Okay.
But that being said, Douyin is now accounting for more than half of the revenues of ByteDance, right? So last year, it was more than half of the $17 billion or so in revenues that the company supposedly had. And Douyin is like a more advanced version of TikTok, right? So TikTok itself, on the other hand, is only expected to do something like $500 million in the US this year. These are all estimates, right? Because as we know, the year hasn't finished. It's a crazy year, and it
Yeah.
just got banned. So who knows? That was an earlier version of basically a business plan, right?
Right.
But the other product, as you would say, is a Toutiao, which is a news app, which I think some people in the Western media have compared it to like a BuzzFeed, but it's very different. It's actually just algorithmic distribution of third-party news content, news-related content. But even calling it news is a little generous because a lot of the quote unquote news on there are basically just articles that it could be about anything. It doesn't have to be about current events. It could literally be about like horoscopes or how to use your microwave or things like that, right? So,
Okay.
but it's text-based content. Um, those are the two primary revenue drivers for ByteDance, which considers itself an AI company, and that is indeed its core competency. That both of these apps are really powered by an artificially intelligent algorithm that basically recommends personalized content to you. Right? Douyin is video or short video, and Toutiao is text. But these are all businesses inside of China. And that is probably why most people in the US haven't heard of them, because they don't use these apps or they're not available here. TikTok is the first product from ByteDance that's really hit it big abroad. But aside from that, ByteDance, because it's been so successful with these two apps, has been, rapidly, frantically, maybe is a better word, developing other products that it hopes will become the next big hit. And it's going after everything. So if you think about these apps, these were content based. Maybe you could call them entertainment apps. But ByteDance is not ruling anything out of what could potentially be its next hit. So it's gone after fintech licenses, indicating a strong interest to develop financial services apps. And it's already announced this year it's going to add 10,000 employees into education. So edtech being a great, like very big focus. It's also announced gaming as one of its core initiatives. And it's also not spinning out, it's also launched enterprise software services as in the cloud and as standalone apps, actually both, as a potential area it's moving into. And there's lots of activity going on for those products inside of ByteDance as well. So it's really unfair to look at it as the maker of TikTok. TikTok on a revenue contribution basis is negligible for
Yeah.
ByteDance at this moment. It's important because of its success and its future monetization prospects.
Wow. Amazing. It really sounds like ByteDance at its core is an artificial intelligence algorithm. And now they're just trying to monetize it beyond Toutiao and TikTok and Douyin, which have already been proven to be wild successes.
In China, yeah. So
Yeah.
obviously they did try to internationalize Toutiao, which was launched in towards the end of 2012, in its first year in existence, but its globalization efforts failed, and they officially shuttered it earlier this year. So TikTok is the first international success, like
Right.
wild international success they had. I mean, Top Buzz, the international version of Toutiao, I think had like 50 million downloads. I think if you were a tiny company, you would be like, "Ooh, that's great," right? But if you're a ByteDance, it doesn't move anything for you. It's not a success.
God, man. Okay, right. So what's interesting is I actually just found out the other day that Musically, which was sort of the precedent for Douyin, I believe, or maybe
Yeah.
TikTok,
Mm-hmm.
is actually Chinese as well. It was founded by some Chinese people with, I think, headquarters both in China and here in Silicon Valley, but ultimately it's got Chinese DNA. I mean, when I first came to know about Musically, I found, I think, some karaoke videos made by some teens in America. And I'm like, God, another one of these time wasting teenage video apps. What are these Silicon Valley Instagrammy people going to think about next? And turns out this is actually Chinese. And I was amazed.
Yeah.
It was So TikTok is 100% made in China. That's great.
TikTok is basically therein lies the administration's problem with it. But you're right
Yeah.
in that one of the ways the administration has tried to pick a fight with TikTok and ByteDance is that it said when TikTok expanded abroad, it really rode on top of the user base of Musical.ly, which, as you noted, was primarily very young people, not even like tweens, right? Not even teens necessarily.
Right.
And that transaction, because ByteDance purchased purchased Musical.ly at the end of 2017 for almost $1 billion. That transaction is now up to a CFIUS investigation, and CFIUS is like the foreign investment investigation arm of the US. And like you said, it's a little bit weird to Chinese media who've basically said, wait, Musical.ly is a Chinese company. It just
Right.
happened to have like a registration in the US. But if you really look at where the founders were from, where they were operating from, other than just like the corporate structure and where the investment dollars came from, it was like USD, blah blah blah. The you could argue it's a Chinese company, right? So because its core is really very Chinese, and it was always referred to in the media as a Chinese company after its acquisition, right? Because people were like, oh my God, so surprising this Chinese company could do so well. But hey, I think
Yeah.
the story could be spun either way depending on what the political ends of the administration is. I think that's the conclusion many of us have in the tech sector.
Right. Okay. And do you think the timing of the ban is sort of a result of trying to divert the attention from the public away from this disastrous situation in America towards, a common enemy, or to win favors for, say, the upcoming, potential re-election?
I think for me personally, I think that's definitely like a possibility, right? I mean, but I don't know what the administration is thinking specifically. I think the
Yeah.
timing has struck many people as quite curious. I think TikTok is actually, for me, much easier to understand because I think one thing we didn't mention is that it's being estimated as having 80 to 100 million daily active users in the US right now. That's bigger than Snapchat, for example. And so I can understand that its scale could be worrisome given its foreign origins. But the other executive order, because there was a pair issued, struck me as much more much much harder for you to use this like national security
Justify?
to justify it. And that was
Yeah.
WeChat, which has
Right.
I think like 2 to 3 million max. Some
Right.
databases are showing a little over 1 million users here in the US because it's just for diaspora, right? And
Didn't New
people
York
with
Times or
business in
something
China.
quote like
Yeah.
18 million or something? And I saw a lot of Twitter
Reuters,
disputing that.
which was then, yes, what Reuters did, and so did Wall Street Journal. I actually emailed the reporter at the Wall Street Journal, sort of pointing out that it's very unlikely. It's 19 million because all of Asian Americans in the US is like 18, and that's including like all the
Yeah.
other people,
Right.
right? Not just
Right.
Chinese people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's actually quite unbelievable, the exaggeration and just the lack of verification of a number that's tied to a national security matter, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to defend them, but they did get it from a third-party provider, and I do think that it's
Yeah,
at the end
but
of the day,
back to the envelope, you
yeah,
can
it's the
sort of
fault of
tell
the
it's
third-party
weird.
provider. But yes, I agree with you
Yeah,
that
yeah,
if there was, but I think if you're not in the app business, you might not be sensitive to these numbers. Whereas, I look at these tech companies all day, and I look at that number and I'm just like immediately that can't be right.
right. So what do you think ByteDance is going to do about this? Do you think they're going to fight it out in courts? Do you think they're just sort of in a wait and see? do you think they kind of, are waiting for November when things everything gets unrolled? Like what's their mindset right now?
Yeah, I don't have any insight into that, but I can tell you what I think the reaction is in China, for example, that's
Sure.
sort of leading them, maybe, you know, giving them some pressure to act a certain way. So number one, I think that the court case that they're waging now against the White House is sort of inevitable. Well, number one, that's how the U.S. system's set up, right? When you disagree, you go fight it out in the courts, and that's just like a very American way of doing things. And this is the U.S. government, so I see that that's just a natural um, step that they have to take. I think that they are probably not going to be able to persuade the administration, given I understand that there are lobbying efforts, unlike the other tech giants, started quite late, right? And that's just because this is the first Chinese company that's gotten significant traction overseas. I'm not sure that they knew that was necessary,
Right.
right?
Right.
So I think they started hiring a lot more people in this space, government relations, whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
this year, but that's probably unlikely to help the current very acute situation. um, Whether or not they can wait till November, I have no idea. I'm not a legal analyst. I think that in general, most people think that a decision of some sort has to be made by September 20th, which is the date when the executive order goes into effect. However, the executive order is worded so vaguely that we don't know what it really means, right? It just says
Right.
any transaction. Actually, right before this show, I was on a interview with a UK media where the other guest was, I guess, a British national who'd been in China for a very long time. He wrote the house that Jack Ma built. He's been in China for a very long time, understands the tech sector very well, and he made a comment which I thought was hilarious. I'll just quote him, which is that he said the executive order reads something like the Chinese government would have written,
Oh
because
man.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, because
Spot on.
it's like sort of vague and up to interpretation, and it's like demonstrates a clear intent, but the execution is very unclear, right? So
Yes.
I think if you work in China tech, you sort of know this is the case, because none of us just really know exactly how it's actually going to be executed. There's just going to be a lot of uncertainty from now until September. Um, but I think most people still think some kind of transaction will go through, because there just seems to be so much momentum around the divestiture of TikTok, and it's US as well as other overseas operations. It's already banned in India, for example, that like people are just
Right.
waiting. And I think most people think it's probably Microsoft, because it makes sense as both having the financial muscle to make the acquisition, as well as you could kind of make the case that there is some strategic element to it, because this is a space in which they're currently have no real
Backing.
no real horses. Yeah, nothing
Yeah.
really. So
Right. 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 True. 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 Yeah. Okay. Great. So could you also talk about the reaction from Chinese people on the ground and say the reaction from Americans on
right.
the
So I
TikTok
think,
ban?
yeah. So I think, again, it's like very general, sort of 30,000 feet look at their reactions. It really depends, right? I think if for people who are working in tech, there is a sense of resignation, combined with indignation. But like, there's a lot of resignation that, like, look, China has been not super friendly to certain social media companies from the US in the past. The services are not allowed to operate there, at least not as they would like to operate them. So there is the sense of quid pro quo and commercial reciprocity. So like, oh well, we did this to them. Kind of, what do you expect? But there is
Right.
some indignation, right? There is some indignation, like, I thought the U.S. had the more open system. I believed this fairy tale, and now it's like there's like a lot of disappointment
Yeah.
that, like, oh, actually maybe it's not as they say. I would say the indignation is extremely high if you just look at the overall population of people who like, whatever your general angry Twitter mob, right? They're just far more angry. Um, and actually, weirdly enough, they're much more angry at Zhang Yiming, who's the CEO of ByteDance, than they are at the U.S. even, because you know these are a lot of like people who are very nationalists. Let's just say that, like, call them
National
for what
pride.
they are. Yeah, they are very
Yeah.
national pride. They're just basically like, hey, we saw this last year with Huawei, and the Huawei team fought back, initiated all these lawsuits for like, actually I'm not sure how many lawsuits they initiated, but like gave this really like hard legal fight, put out a lot of press releases that were pretty strongly worded, defended themselves, and like, why are you not doing the same? You are embarrassing us, right? You like basically you are this like weak person that like bows down to the merest intimidation. And so there's a lot of backlash against ByteDance in
Right.
particular, actually, which is odd, which is not like the thing I would have expected
Yeah.
to see this. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, I wonder how much of this is just internet rhetoric and netizens ranting rather than actual, boycott of the apps. Oh, I'm gonna stop using Douyin. It's now time to use Kuaishou instead. You know?
I think I, I don't know. I don't think, yeah, I don't think
Yeah.
any movement like this, boycott, whatever, gets that much traction. It is just generally emotional venting for the companies. But at the same time, I think it does do serious PR damage if it continues for long enough, right?
Right.
And that's because, let's face it, ByteDance doesn't actually have a great reputation in China.
Oh, I did not
So
know that.
yeah, so in the sense that it's not like people are like, oh, it's a source of national pride, like, or anything like that, right? It's like ByteDance has been extremely controversial. I mean, the story is that um, I mean, I can pinpoint you to the time. I think it was probably May, June, 2018. Anyway, somewhere around middle of the year, where they even started to use the company name ByteDance, because prior to that, even though they always had this name in their official documents, they just let the media refer to them as Toutiao because that was their, hit app, right? So they didn't really make an effort to brand themselves as ByteDance until in about April, I think, of 2018. This is actually the first podcast episode we did. They had one of their apps be banned permanently from the app stores by the Chinese government. So this which is a very sort of rare thing for the government to do. The government like will often have you take off the apps to fix something for usually inappropriate content. A lot of times actually it's been like pornography related, but in this case it was just like permanently banned. There was sort of no negotiation room. It wasn't ByteDance's most popular app, but it was actually their very first app, and it was called 内涵段子, and it was like a jokes and memes app. And for whatever reason, I never used it because by the time I heard about it, it was already banned.
Okay.
And there was a lot of negative PR also at the time. Some think it's instigated by Tencent, their nemesis, but there was also a lot of um, negative PR at the time, echoing exactly the sentiments you had earlier, which is like, oh my God, this company, all they do is make all this like time wasting software. They're leading our youth astray, right? Like no one's really doing, it's just like such a negative product. It has no value to society.
Digital opium,
Yeah, what would
as
you say?
digital
It's the
opium, as a
digital.
famous academic recently went on record to call
Oh
TikTok.
yeah, we could definitely talk about that. Yeah,
We
they didn't
should.
use the word opium, but it was definitely like, I think maybe like some people might have used sort of
Drug.
other not so great substances to basically say, hey, this company has problems, right? Like maybe they make great products, but their value system is not what we want in our society. So ByteDance actually did I think like a rebranding at that point. You could argue, I mean, I'm sure the company is going to say like, no, that was something we just had planned already, but the timing was curious. And so, and that controversy has always stayed with them. In fact, today, if you go on Quora, right, Chinese version of Quora, not Quora itself, which is a website called Zhihu, and just like look up, how do you feel about, ByteDance's apps? And you'll just get so much negative comments, people upvoting on negative comments about saying like this app is a waste of time. I think it's destroying society, all those same sentiments you expressed earlier. So it's by no means like some beloved asset, in China. It's controversial.
I see. I'm really curious about this sentiment, this negative sentiment against TikTok, because I mean, isn't it true that gaming is a big deal in China? There are esport tournaments, there
Mm-hmm.
are kids playing many different types of games, and these games have, made many a billionaire in China.
Yeah.
So is the society more accepting of these games than something like TikTok?
No, I don't think so. So I think there is this. So esports, number one, is really big. Like you said, right? You can just look at the numbers. We've done several. I think we've done one main episode on esports, but just off of the top of my head, it's like China's like, roughly like half of the users and half of the viewers, right? Sorry, the players as well as the viewers, because esports, you sort of want to. It's important to understand the concentration in both. Um, that being said, I think games have a very also controversial sort of reputation in China, because China has a thriving gaming industry. But at the same time, it's generally not like looked, it's not generally like considered like if you're a gamer, it is still a little bit like you're a loser. I think it's changing, but it's not like considered something you should be really proud of. And that's just because the education system is so intense there. So if you're a younger person, you're playing games, it's not uncommon actually for your parents. Number one, there are all these mechanisms for you to limit their game playing, but there are these camps where you can send your kids to, these anti-addiction camps, which, yeah, some of them were in the news actually for using quite physical torture methods to basically beat the kids into submission. I'll just put it very bluntly. And it's not a nice thing they're doing, and they got in trouble for it. But like, I'm just saying, this is how serious parents sometimes took their kids' game playing. That being said, it's not uncommon at all for like a lot of Chinese adults to be playing games. So I think it's much more accepted if you're like already working and you don't have to worry about the college entrance exam. But in general, I think parents, if I try to read a lot of like pop culture content in addition to tech media. So I can definitely tell you that gaming is like constantly like one of the top concerns of parents. As they they're very concerned. They do think it's like a digital narcotic. They do think that, they need to have harsh intervention methods if their kids are hooked on games. Yeah, very
Got it.
serious, which is why the
Right.
government has put in a lot of rules around this, by the way, while still also, letting the gaming industry thrive by giving it other subsidies in the form of like esports as well. So it is like, it does seem weird, but I would say they're very against
How's
games
the
for
government
minors.
subsidizing the esports
Oh,
industry?
there's a lot of not the central government. So the way in China, the way it works is the central government often has some. Actually, I'm not sure about esports. But let me just tell you generically how it often works is the central government will have some kind of like direction, right?
Yeah.
We should all push towards this direction. And then they'll have some like very big KPIs, and then it'll be sort of interpreted down to the very, very local level, even to the district level, on what the district can do to contribute to this high level KPI, right?
Right.
So for esports, you see that for certain municipalities that are trying to get more innovation, high tech into their region, that they sort of think esports as high tech and as one of the ways they can fulfill this like upgrading of the economy into a more digital economy. And certain cities have subsidies for, I'm not sure if it's like players or teams or whatever it is, but they or tournaments. Um, my friend John Oliveris runs a China Esports Digest, and he has a lot more detail on that. But effectively, you can think of it as these are encouraged industries in certain municipalities who have decided that this is the way they're going to differentiate and upgrade their economy.
Got it. Completely understand. Okay, so let's circle back to something we talked about a little bit earlier. This British American academic that went on record to call TikTok, and I
Mm-hmm.
quote, a
Mm-hmm.
digital fentanyl to get our kids stoked for the coming Chinese imperium. So there's a lot to unpack
Yeah.
there. Could you
Yeah.
maybe just talk about your reaction to this and maybe also just the reasoning and the motive behind the statement? I mean, I personally have very strong knee-jerk reaction to this, and I'm actually, frankly, quite surprised that this came out of somebody that's quite learned and supposedly has high resolution thinking.
Yeah, and I think that's actually probably one of the statements where we like really connected, right? We're just like, wait,
Yeah, yeah,
this needs to be addressed. Um, so I think like I don't know this historian very well. Like I actually bought one of his books, The Ascent of Money, but I never read it. So I'll be very honest. Like I don't
yeah. Me
actually
too, actually.
know. I don't know his other
Yeah.
views.
Yes.
Um, but I have a huge problem with that statement in particular and the way the argument was laid out, just because like of my understanding of tech, right? So other people have then since given me like context that, oh yeah, like don't be surprised. This is sort of along the lines of all his views, but you know, I think most of us probably just don't know what it is. So only unpacking this statement, I think number one, it's ridiculous because um, he's sort of he's I first had a problem with the fact that he called it digital fentanyl. And that's because as someone who's really concerned about the effect of technology on human well-being, I actually went and took a graduate level class on the science of addiction, right? And from a neuroscientific perspective. So I went and took a neuroscience class specifically on dopamine addiction. And we went through other neurotransmitters. This is part of my graduate degree in psychology. And because I really was that concerned, right? There was a lot of rhetoric in Silicon Valley about like how apps were just like, were like drugs, and it was like the same level of dopamine hit or whatever. And I was like, is that true? Because if it is, I don't want to be in this industry. That does not, align with my overall goals for my life. So I took this class very seriously, and I can tell you that like that is just not true. Like fentanyl is first of all, dopamine is like something that is not just for pleasure. It actually allows for your movement. I mean, Parkinson's is when you don't have enough dopamine, so you can't move, right? Fentanyl is extremely dangerous. I mean, it can kill you in like very, very small amounts because, yeah, if the neurotransmitter that controls movement stops working, then you can't breathe, right? So you like, again, the fatality like factor we're talking about here just makes the things not comparable. So even from just like a science perspective, I was just like, dude, that is so irresponsible to say, and that is clearly just like clickbait, right?
Yeah.
And then secondly is like the situation with the opium war doesn't make sense. I even went back and like looked up the Wikipedia because I was like, I'm not a historian. I learned about the opium wars in like high school. I don't really know, right, what it does. And I just have a vague idea of what it is. So for that analogy to stand, that would mean China like outlawed, right, opium, and then purposefully exported it for the purpose of like taking over, right, like the imperialistic.
Yeah.
It was an imperialistic endeavor, and that's not true, right? Like as we just said, Douyin has sort of 400 million daily active users in China. It's a more advanced like higher, let's call it higher potency, time wasting app than TikTok, right? So, and it has like 4 times the number of daily active users in China. So, that metaphor doesn't make any sense unless you're saying like, I'm also trying to kill my own citizens with, by the way, a stronger dose of this. And then I'm exporting you guys like the weak version, right?
Right.
Like, I was
Right.
like, what? Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell,
I
but
see.
tell us how it struck you.
I think the statement was incorrect, in multiple levels. So first of all, the connection between the government and this private company, right? It's the statement is implying that this is
Right.
some kind of
State,
conspiracy
yeah,
for
state
the state
action.
to
Mm-hmm.
basically export this drug to destroy the future
Mm-hmm.
of America
Mm-hmm.
through this innocuous looking app. But the truth is that I think the relationship between the government and that particular company has not particularly been very cozy, right? It's
Yeah.
actually, there's a lot of tension and discomfort. So that's number one. Number two is that, I mean, aren't there a lot of these harmful apps in America already? In
Yeah.
fact, it's not just apps, it's just, websites. And I'm pretty sure pornography is outlawed in China,
Yeah, it
but
is.
it's not so here, right? And so, I mean, aren't there theories about how kids are only like 3 clicks away on Google Images to anything inappropriate?
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, there's also this just, I think, I don't know if hypocrisy is the right word, but just this inability to recognize the existence of digital fentanyl in the US as it is. And so let's see, what else? And I think the last thing is this intent. So
Mm-hmm.
this whole idea of Chinese imperium, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I don't know if the Chinese government actually has that kind of ambition. I have a feeling that I mean, I don't know what necessarily what's going through their head, but just based on my observation, I think the aggressor in a lot of these international relations has actually not been China. China just wants to do their thing. It's like 老百姓就是要好好过日子 and just don't get involved in my business. So, and I think some of these China hawks are misinterpreting the state's intentions and just slapping these right-wing accusations. So yeah, so on multiple levels, I didn't agree, but I think the most shocking point is actually deeply respected this academic. And I guess I still do, right? One statement does not change my impression on a particular person. But I'm still getting my head around this. And he's not someone that needed a clickbait, right? So it felt
Right.
like this came from a place of either deep-seated bias or, I mean, I don't know, maybe he's getting funded or something by some organization that requires that he exports these points of view through his Bloomberg articles and tweets.
Right. You
Yeah.
have said that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, I have no idea, right? I'm actually, I pay almost no attention to political news, being forced to right now because of the Trump administration. But realistically, like, I don't at all. And I don't really know like the intention. Again, I can't speak for the intention of the Chinese government or anything, but at the same time, yeah, I do feel that the metaphor was extremely inappropriate for those reasons, right? Like that you're number one linking the state and a private company together. And I think I personally probably that's what's most alarming to me. And I'm just afraid that in general that we get into a society not just facing like Chinese companies. What about like U.S. companies and other companies where in other countries where the quote unquote opposite side will then just start equating every private enterprise with whatever state that they're being governed by. I think that's very problematic, and it's so sad because having worked in tech, I felt that there was so much commonality between the founders I met, no matter which country I went to, right? And that was one of the reasons why I actually joined 500 Startups when I started my VC journey, and that was because my boss at the time, Dave McClure, the founder of the fund, was all about that. He was all about how it was founders are the same no matter where you go, whether they're in Yemen or Ethiopia or Taiwan or, Minnesota. So to take away sort of that human aspect of the conversation and put it all in like terms of the state was deeply disturbing to me as an individual, because this just doesn't fit with anyone I've met. I've never met a founder, like wherever they are based, to have a political aim as their sort of first primary consideration. It's very
Well,
sad.
yeah, but regarding that last statement, let's maybe dig in a little bit. I have actually seen tweets by movers and shakers in Silicon Valley that are sort of sounding off on crazy conspiracy theories. So one example is somebody was mentioning how, maybe in jest, but the
Mhm.
opioid pandemic might have been a China attack. And then another person is basically saying how US is 1,000% focused on being scrupulous, and China is an unscrupulous enemy that the US isn't even aware about fighting. What do you think about the proliferation of these ideas among some of these, say, influencers within Silicon Valley? How do you think that will affect, say, anything remotely China or Chinese related in Silicon Valley? Say, let's say, lives of people of Chinese descent.
Right, like myself.
Yeah, like us.
It's very disappointing, but I guess I'm trying to approach it from a sort of more empathetic viewpoint, which is that, look, my knee-jerk reaction was also, wow, that really gets a rise out of me, right? Because not those statements necessarily that you said, but a lot of some of the other statements where Chinese American companies were sort of like insinuated as being also controlled by the Chinese state, which I was like, dude, that's so messed up.
Like Karma Credit,
No, not even. Well, I
Credit
don't know
Karma,
what. Oh, credit. No,
Credit
no, no, no,
Karma.
no, no.
Yeah.
Like Newsbreak was a company that is founded by that is has like Harry Shum as its chairman, is focused on U.S. local news. The founder, or the CEO at least, did you know get his feet wet in China in terms of entrepreneurship, but like was educated here, and a lot of the team is based here. So yeah, basically making. By the way, a few of my friends work there, and it's like pretty sure
Okay.
they would disagree with that assessment. But basically, like I think those things probably turn me on. No, sorry, not turn me off. Turn me off a little bit more. Uh, but I think trying to take an empathetic viewpoint, which is that this is a time of pandemic, and that people are probably not even cognizant of how that's affecting their emotions, and maybe probably bringing out some of the worst biases in themselves, because there's this like constant base level of fear, right? Because your physical safety is not guaranteed right now. So I'm just trying to apply like a more psychological perspective. And that being said, of course, that doesn't mean you don't um, respond, right? So I think while I can empathize that maybe these are not necessarily their most deeply held thoughts, I think what's dangerous also about the pandemic is one of the articles I retweeted, which was likening social media in times of pandemic to porn, which is that it basically normalizes the outliers, right? So um, if because we have so limited like channels of communication these days, that like whatever you see online starts becoming much more salient, and you're also spending more time online because there's no other way for you to get together. So you basically have these self-reinforcing like prophecies, right? So whatever the outlier becomes normal, and then it becomes true. So I do think the important thing is to recognize that such extreme viewpoints should be responded to, but I guess also recognize that maybe these people are just like more frustrated than they think, and might be not quite aware of what they're saying, myself included, right? I find myself that um, I am probably more easily angered and irritated than I might be in normal times, because my physical activity is so restricted, and I there's so much uncertainty in my life, right? I'm trying to get married and we've like delayed I'm already married. We're trying to have a wedding and we've already delayed like the wedding, like, twice. And we still don't know if like it's actually going to happen like on that day,
Yeah. Right. Right.
So
Right. Well, there are these Zoom weddings. I think it's actually a pretty mature industry at this point. It's probably like a Zoom caterer, a Zoom like musician. Yeah, I'm jesting. Sorry to hear that. I think there's definitely sort of a catalyst in terms of driving people even further apart by the pandemic, because
Mhm.
prior to this, people are already spending a lot of time on very different websites and absorbing information from very different sources. Like me and my neighbor could be, from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed, like just watch different videos of totally different viewpoints, and maybe
Right.
not centrist viewpoints, but very ideologue driven ones.
Right.
But previously we were forced to, like, we're integrated, right? We have to go to the office and I have to talk to
Right.
people. I have to,
Yeah.
I sit next to somebody on the train, but now all that's gone, right? So
Yeah.
any kind of this sort of separation movement has only been accelerated as a result. So maybe that sort of
Yeah.
explains these more extreme sentiments. Yeah, but I
Yeah.
think when you mentioned pandemic, I also thought that maybe part of it is just that Americans, regardless of industry or say education level, do have some frustration about the fact that this virus came from China,
Yep.
right?
Yeah,
And
for
the
sure.
fact that an early whistleblower, was censored and then subsequently died of the disease didn't help with that
Right.
narrative. So
No.
then people are just like, like, we really got screwed by those guys, right? So now let's find like all these other things that are happening with regard to that country. They're just going to apply a very negative lens to it. So, it's hard. I can sort of relate to it.
Yeah, and understandably, I think, all those things are true. And there is a lot of anger, and I think, the frustration is warranted. But at the same time, I think we are in a different type of crisis right now with regards to how this country manages the pandemic. And unfortunately, even living here, like I think one of the examples given in that article I just cited, but I personally felt was very true, was that when people ask me, how is the pandemic situation in California? I really think that if I were to rely on my personal experience, I could not give you an answer. I don't know, right? Because I'm primarily in my house. Like, I rarely see my neighbors. We don't like interact with each other because everyone's scared of COVID. So I can only go by what I see when I go to the store, where everyone's just wearing a mask and we're not talking to each other. I don't know what their experience is.
Yeah.
And I don't do that very often. I do that like once a week, maybe. And, and then it's just based on social media. And I'm basically like, hey, your guess is as good as mine. I don't know how people are feeling, right? So
Yeah.
and for my friends, I feel like I have to actively reach out and ask them how they're feeling, even because let's face it, they're not
Yeah.
necessarily super aware of how they're feeling. I had one friend who called me and was like, hey, Ray, I'm actually really depressed, but I couldn't figure out why, because this month it's been the same as last month. In fact, work has been a little easier, but I feel just really down. And she's like, oh, I can't figure out why. And I was like, but that is the problem. The problem is nothing has changed, right? Your level of uncertainty in living your life is exactly the same, and it's just getting to you. So it's not even just that like we can't talk to each other. It's just that even the level of, I think people are calling it anticipatory grief or anxiety, right? Uncertainty is not something that we typically handle very, very well, and we can't even articulate those emotions or identify them. What
Yeah.
I've been trying to do is I've been because, like I said, of the aforementioned sort of isolation that we're all living in, and the difficulty it is. The difficulty there is for us to make connections and really understand what each other's thinking. I have been having more active conversations with people, like privately, one-on-one, about what they hope to be the future, like political, like administrations aside, right? Just like, what is your vision for the future? And I think that at least in Silicon Valley, I am mostly cheered by the fact that most people still believe, at least the people I'm talking to, most people still believe in sort of this view of open innovation, of competition, of not using regulation to win, right? So
Right.
one person used a really good analogy, which was there is sort of the Google model of innovation, which is, at least when they first started, which is encouraging competition and being like, I can beat you because I'm better, right? I don't need to like play little games and kill you, versus Comcast, which is like, I guess, using a lot of regulatory and sort of uh, I don't know if they're unscrupulous, but like maybe not the most open ways to kill off their competition. And I do think people in Silicon Valley are still very much in favor of the former, because that we understand that that's what makes Silicon Valley special, and that's what makes it sustainable, and that's why the innovation continues to come out of here. I think in general, being an immigrant, despite what the rhetoric is in DC, and I don't even follow whatever people are saying, I think there's still great appreciation for the talents that immigrations, not just from China, but from everywhere in the world, really brings, especially to where we live right now. So I'd say overall, there is still like a lot of enthusiasm for globalism, right? So by globalism, I just mean this sort of borderless, like at least intellectual capital flow, and this belief that that sort of interaction and openness is what's going to push the human race forward, right? So
Yeah.
like maybe like one of my favorite franchises is Star Trek. Really, like, I'm just like, hey, let's focus on how we're going to get to the stars, why, or how are we going to solve climate change. and
Yeah.
and I still think there's a lot of people like me where honestly we're not interested in the politics. We are interested in, sort of like, of course, fair business practices, like, and everyone cares about human rights, but at the same time, like, we are primarily interested in how do we move the entire species forward in a way that's meaningful, using the tools available to us today. And I think at the very least, I don't know about a rollback, but the sort of hope and openness, I just keep on referring to the word openness, that I personally had when I first moved to China like 13 years ago. I want that to be there for my children, right? So, and as you already know from my story, I wasn't even trying to move to China, right? I was
Right.
actually really interested in New York. I was like, oh, let's go to New York, you know. But whatever, I ended up in Shanghai, and then the fact that I had, well, because I was bilingual and understood the culture, that I could have the same opportunities and experience some like really interesting things in a different country, um, is something I want to be available to everyone else, because it really defined my experience as a human being. And I think it's just overall like positive for society. It's just like it opens your horizons, and it makes you feel closer to other people in general.
Yeah. Right. Oh gosh, I wonder if there's this kind of prisoner's dilemma situation though. So imagine if there are only two superpowers in the world, which it sort of is the case, and then one of them is completely open, the other is completely closed. It just feels like the one that's completely open is more vulnerable net, right? It's you got your advantages by being completely open. You absorb the best talents, but
Mm-hmm.
your disadvantage is that you're just sharing everything you learned. And the problem right now is that a lot of this IP is very difficult to create or discover, but it's very easy to copy. And then the one that's completely closed would just take that and then use it to its advantage. And if that closed entity is of adversarial nature to the open one, allegedly,
Mm-hmm.
then
Mm-hmm.
then it's then it will just bring harm. So as a result, it just seems that when both entities take on open, when their statuses are both open, it's actually better for
Mm-hmm.
both of them. But then everyone has the incentive to be for trying to be closed. And yeah, and I think Trump basically sort of is walking that line, right? He's basically saying
Mm-hmm.
these people have been taking advantage of our country for so long through WTO, through IP thefts, and just blatant piracy and spies and whatnot. Then now it's time for us to also take to become this little man, become this lesser person. And let's, who cares? If they're closed, we're closed. My personal feeling is that I actually think it's not going to work out too well if the US were to close itself, because I think China is already like not taking, but China already has like a great foundation. It's got a very healthy entrepreneurial culture and a very good VC/startup ecosystem. And the country is very gung-ho in terms of pushing various frontier technologies forward. So, and also it's not plagued by all these different problems that are happening in the US right now, the race riots, the erosion of social fabric, the the huge unemployment numbers, and just the invisible enemy that's the virus, right? So I basically feel that if US were to turn away, and also like they're going to have this huge brain drain of the world's best talent no longer coming here and staying in China, I think it's going to spell trouble for the country in America.
Yeah, I actually think the brain drain problem is probably, at least for me, that's the one I think I understand a little bit better. The other ones that you mentioned, yeah, I don't personally know what the long-term effects will be, but if you look at sort of the flow of intellectual capital between the two countries, I think there is a lot of evidence that, China lost their best to the US, right? So my dad came here for his PhD. He had to prepare for 2 years for a test that only allowed one person from all the universities in the city of Xi'an, which was, I looked it up, about 1.5 million people at the time, and had some of the best universities in central China. And there's only one slot every year. And he fought really hard. I remember, some of my earliest memories are of him studying, me sitting on his lap, to come here to the US, right? So whereas if you look at the people we're sending over to China, I mean, I was one of them. Well, I wasn't sent there. I did go there, but I did not nearly have to be like that level, right? I could be anyone really and show up in China and be like, hey, I'm looking for employment. So I think that the level of talent that gotten from China, like, look at Li Feifei, right, who was at Google AI, Stanford CS professor, just like extremely well-known, cutting edge researcher in that respect. She came to the US, I think, when she was 12, something like that, right? So
Yeah.
these are the level of immigrants that the US has been able to attract because of its openness, right? Well, I don't think my parents would have come here if it was a very closed country and they did not see a future for themselves here, which is unfortunately becoming more and more the case. And so I think that is actually just very tragic. I'm especially concerned about that because of the level of STEM talent that tends to come here to the US. And call me selfish, but I committed to Silicon Valley. I live here, my family's here, and I want to see Silicon Valley thrive. And it's very unfortunate that some of these anti-immigration policies are hitting tech the hardest.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think maybe it's just that the advantage of this place is shrinking, but it's still very much in the lead. So
It is very much like, I think if you talk to, so number one, right, like I think my friends at Macro Polo, a think tank, have done a really good job showing just if you're talking about like top talent, but you're tiering it by sort of like the most innovative research, which is like generally the most cited at the most prestigious conferences and whatnot. The US is still in the lead by quite a bit. Despite the fact that a lot of the researchers that are producing this type of research are Chinese born, but they all want to live here and raise their kids here because of the openness, right? Like, yeah. I'm friends with a lot of them, and I'm also friends with a lot of Chinese engineers who want to come here, right? Even if they know that, like, even today, right? Like literally, like this week, I've had conversations with people who want to come here. You know why? Because it's the open society, yes, but the better standard of living. I mean, if you actually know China, the jobs there have very long hours, especially in tech. Tech is kind of famous for having grinding hours, at least 60-hour weeks, and they don't like the education system for their kids. They want a more open, less regimented education system for their kids, and the environment is better here. There's less pollution, right? So like it's just a better lifestyle. And if they're just going to be coding all day, they'd rather be in a place where the air and water is clean and they can go home and spend some time with their family, instead of, actually quite a few of them lived separate from their family because of the nature of their work and the hours it requires, right? So the personal
Right.
sacrifices is actually intense.
Okay. I wonder though if there's a sliver of Chinese people that might find life in China more attractive than here. So you mentioned the various factors. There's the environment, there is children's education, and there's the long hours. I suppose if you're somebody that's going to be working long hours anyway, you probably don't mind the long
Like in
hours back in
banking.
China.
Yeah.
Yeah, like investment,
Okay.
or like an
Mm-hmm.
entrepreneur, right? And
Yeah,
if
yeah,
you are
yeah.
the kind of boss that wants your people to be working really hard, like Elon Musk, he was praising the Chinese factory workers for
Right,
being smart
right,
and diligent.
right.
You
Or
know,
Michael
I
Moritz at Sequoia, he also praised the 996, and
did
that
he?
actually
Wow.
caused quite a stir. Yeah. But I
Yes,
mean, I
yes, yes.
understand where he's coming from. I understand where he's coming from. That is the grind is responsible. Let's be realistic. It's responsible for, a lot of the progress, right? If someone's working 50% more hours than you are day after day after day, those gains will accumulate.
Right. And then also, I feel that, maybe there's some advantages, and who knows, maybe this is just me being grass is greener on the other side because I spent way less time in China than you. But when I think about China, I see just new things happening every day, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
Like the information that I
Mm-hmm.
consume, I assume the people I would be associated with, the types of things they'll be doing are just very exciting and full of opportunities. Like one example was today I was reading an article about an escape room founder.
Yeah.
So this is an escape room called Omega Escape, Escape.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, so he created escape games with subway stations in Beijing and Shanghai, and he
Oh.
created an escape game with like a remote city in north of China after being very successful at creating a franchise with like 30 or 40 different cities, all offering his games. So the backstory is he started doing this, I think, when Wang was in vogue. And that was like, I don't
Wow.
know,
Okay.
2005 or something. So he's
Yeah, it is.
definitely, yeah, he's definitely one of the forefathers of escape games in China. And then he started talking about how he wanted to gamify the Gugong visiting experience, the Forbidden City
Mhm.
experience. And he basically created some app where people were solving puzzles through learning more about Gugong and therefore
Yeah.
making their trip to the Forbidden City more interesting. So I was
Mhm.
reading this, and this is only one of the very many examples I was reading, and I just assumed that all these things are able to happen because China is very quickly catching on in terms of diversifying its economic offerings and business opportunities. And Chinese people are smart, intelligent, and now all these opportunities are available. So now it just seems like an explosion of new information everywhere. And to me, I just feel that life in China would be so much more exciting, and life in the Silicon Valley seems so stagnant. Maybe let's jump
Mhm.
over to the expats life question, right? So being in China,
Mhm.
so you made the decision of coming back to the US, right? You had some other
Mhm.
friends that had very similar backgrounds professionally and personally and culturally back when you were in China that probably stayed there, right? How do
Mhm.
you how do you think about the trade-offs you guys made, and how do
Mhm.
you think about how your life would have been if you had stayed in China? Would you feel that there's certain things that you'd be suffering through, or things that you would be appreciating much more than living here in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I think really good question. And I do think it's a case of the grass is greener on the other side when earlier you were talking, because they think
Okay.
I can name very many pros about living in China as an expat, right? So again, we're comparing sort of like a upper middle class lifestyle.
Sure.
Um, where you also your peers are all very well educated, you're living in the center usually of a big city, and Chinese cities are now very very advanced, very convenient. Infrastructure is good, you can basically find anything you want. When I first arrived in China, there was very little Western food, so like I said, I consider myself very Californian. So like, and I'm vegetarian. So I was like looking for salads, and
Oh yeah.
just like 3 salad shops. Right. And then now it's like, you can find it anywhere. Right. Like they're like legitimately venture funded salad chains, and just all kinds of food, artisanal coffee, like basically anything you can think of in the US exists in these first tier cities in downtown, right? People doing intermittent fasting or like whatever it is. I think that the convenience and the fact that labor is still more cheap there, right? So, everyone had a maid, an IE, and no one really needed to um, do anything for themselves. They could always pay like a quidee, right? Like a courier to like run
Yeah.
around for them.
Got it.
And whatever it is, you can hire an intern for like 150 RMB a day, like a well-educated university intern. And that's like about $20, right? And that's if you're paying for them. You could probably get them for less if you were really cruel. But basically, like there's a lot of things that are cheaper there, but at the same time, I think the things that mattered for me, which is why like that, having family that's close, right? That's just like priceless. Now I see my parents, because of the pandemic, we see them far less, but like before the pandemic, I could see them every week because they're 25 minutes away. That's like, that, to me, that's priceless, right? And the education, yes, you can send them to international school, but at the same time, like that's just like a very, if you talk to international school kids, like that's a very different experience than even like I went to public school. That's like very different, right? So maybe you want them to have a slightly more diverse experience, because outside of school, they can be disconnected from the rest of Chinese society in some ways. And I think that for me as a woman, I'll just be very honest, China is a very sexist society. I think I was able to get away with it in certain ways because I like had this persona where anytime I felt like there was a little bit of sexism, I would just like play the I'm a foreigner card, right? So I would basically play the I know China really well card, which I did, and I could basically pass for a local in almost anything. But anytime I felt like there was a little bit of pushback because of my gender, and sometimes because of ageism is also less so in tech, but it was a big deal in like real estate and media. Yeah, I would just
So
play the foreigner
discrimination
card.
against younger people,
Oh yeah, of
age.
course, of
Yeah.
course. Like to be like you're like how much could you possibly know? You're like,
Yeah.
30 or whatever, right? So it's much better in tech. Anyway, so I would just be like, I don't understand. I would just like brush these comments off because I'd be like, I didn't get that because I'm from the US, even though I like understood it.
Yeah.
So, but those things exist. And, let's face it, like in China, it was very hard for me to find a husband, right? I wanted to be married. I wanted to just had a family. I ended up dating pretty much all expats, but, I had many local friends who were in very unhappy relationships because of various social reasons, which could probably be a whole nother 3-hour conversation. But like again, those situations that you read about, well, if you're reading about them, are real. Like I've experienced them. I have friends who experience them. It's yeah, it's
In
the
terms
real
of the
bias.
unhappy relationships, are
Mm-hmm,
you specifically referring to, say, the rising income within
mm-hmm,
the female community, especially in the middle upper class echelon,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
and therefore, the traditional view is women want to marry
mm-hmm,
a man that seems stronger, that seems the provider type, but
mm-hmm.
those men are in short supply now that women have been, elevating their status in various different ways. And
Yeah.
and therefore, the relationship just doesn't seem healthy. It just seems like the psyche of humans have not caught up with the reality of the times.
Yeah.
Is that
It
what you're referring to?
A little bit. No. It's far more complex than that, right? So I think
Okay.
in China, like when you marry, you do marry the parents, your in-laws, for
Oh boy.
better or for worse, right?
Yeah.
So your in-laws can have a lot of like direct control over your lifestyle because they could be living with you, or
Yeah.
they're living very close to you,
Right.
or just like it's generally considered like you have to follow what your parents say no matter sort of how unreasonable it is, right? Then that's like, luckily for me, my parents don't believe that because they've been here 35 years, so they don't
Right.
tell me anything. But if for many of my parent friends who are in China and whose parents never left, like that is very much what they expect. It would be very weird if they expect something else. Actually, they would be considered unconventional. And the fact that, like as you mentioned, income levels have been rising for women. This is something where, by the way, in the last 5 years, I've seen a lot of change. So it has become better, but it's not to the level where we are in the US. And the US is still unequal, right? But like it's still far better than China, where like there's still this belief by many people, aside from sort of the urban elites, that if you're, for example, a female PhD, this is what they like to joke around, right? Like, if you're a girl and you get a PhD, that's like sort of for sure not like knocking yourself out of the race for a husband, because again, like the tradition is that the husband should be better educated than you and make more money than you, basically be better than you in every way. So if you're already like a PhD, like what do they have to be? Like, I don't know, postdoc, like double PhD. So like that is definitely still I would say still, it's starting to narrow as a dominant stereotype, but it's still very prevalent. And I'm cheered by the fact that the trend seems to be accelerating. It might be better, but like, at least as of the time I left in 2015, I had the strong, um, like conviction at the time that if I were going to have kids, unless I was like definitely just gonna have, I don't know, do gender selection, have all sons or something, like I would not raise my daughter in China. That was like sort of a very strong opinion I
Wow.
had. Yeah. And
Wow.
it's like myself as well, right? Like so my name, if the viewers know Chinese, is it's become like a much more popular name, but it is basically a unisex name. And in fact, most Chinese people, I think until recently, when the character got more popularized, like assumed it's a masculine name because it sounds quite masculine. And the reason I was given a masculine name is because my parents were hoping and actually thought I was going to be a boy, and were very disappointed when I wasn't, right? So and it's like such a common story amongst people my age, that like that preference for boys is still there.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, I mean, I'm still learning every day about the experience of being a woman from my wife, or being a woman in China, or being a Chinese woman in America specifically. It is very different. I do feel things have gotten a little bit better now,
Yeah,
but
yeah, for sure.
yeah, but I don't know what it's like for, say, the average person in
Right.
China, right? We're only talking about a bubble that we live in.
Right. Yeah. If you're like an executive, uh, and a lot of people like to point to like, oh yeah, look at Taobao or whatever. They have so many female executives, but I can tell you, like in the same breath, that like some of these VCs I talk to, actually, I don't even need to name any names because some of these have made their opinion public, that like, yeah, wouldn't invest in a female entrepreneur, you know, because
We do
it's
not,
like,
or we do.
no, yeah, they would not. They would not. Yeah. And it's
Okay.
not because they think like females are dumb or anything like that, right? Like that's so unprogressive, right? They're just
Okay.
saying like the reality of it is that this society expects you to be the primary caretaker, and expects you to take the initiative. For example, when if your in-laws or your family basically has any problems, so the demand on your time, even if you hire help, but like the way people describe it is like, oh yeah, it doesn't matter how rich you are still responsible for your kids like education, like as the mother, right? So everyone will look at you as a failed mother if your kids don't do well, but very few people would like blame the father because the father's busy doing his
Yeah.
thing.
Right.
So even if you had all the wealth in the world and you had all this help, you still need to be the person planning. So just that level of mental energy that you need to devote to this just makes you inferior to a male candidate. assuming you guys have sort of the same drive and, abilities and whatnot. So that's a
Yeah.
very, I think, I hope it's becoming less common, but at least as of when I left, that was commonly held belief by both male and females, right? And I was personally shocked because when I was at 500, we actually tried to raise a small syndicate for female founders. And like we asked a lot of female entrepreneurs and investors. And of course, since I was in China at the time, I was in charge of talking to Chinese investors and entrepreneurs who had the money, who would be able to participate. And even one lady, I remember very clearly, she made a name for herself in China as a female entrepreneur. And I was very, very upset when she declined to invest because she said, I truly don't believe females can do it better because they need to take care of more things. And that was coming from someone who made this like sort of their main selling point in the media. And, I was just very shocked. So long story short, I asked 10 people, all of them were female. 5 of them gave me that same, like roughly the same answer. So I was very disappointed.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Well, according to the rules of capitalism, ultimately the capital just chases wherever the returns are.
Mhm.
So supposedly money doesn't see color, it doesn't see gender, it just sees, I guess, returns. So I don't know. Hopefully this will help change things around. I mean, personally,
Right.
I actually know lots of very successful, aggressive, and talented female entrepreneurs. And I would
Mhm.
make the case that I think among international students in
Mhm.
America,
Mhm.
I think in general, I see many women entrepreneurs. Like some
Mhm.
would work for a company and still try to start a side business.
Mhm.
Some would just go and build a startup.
Mhm.
And yeah, actually quite a few. One of them already came on this podcast, and I look forward to interviewing quite a few others. So I think when you're describing, to be honest, actually paints a very different reality because I have not been in China for so long, right? So
Mhm.
but I do feel
Yeah.
that once they come to a place that's much more open, they kind of
Mhm.
unleash their power. And maybe that's why they don't want to go back and they want to be here.
I can tell you that is a given. That is a reason that's been given to me by personal acquaintances. I do think that, again, I'm just being realistic as a female. I personally, think that you have a tougher time in China um, from your personal life, right? So, but again, it depends on what people's priorities are. There are lots of people for whom that's not an issue, or that's an issue they will consider later after they get their career in order. And like you said, because of the I don't know what you want to call it, dynamicism or volatility and or just growth in the Chinese market, that there's a lot of opportunity there, especially when maybe you have sort of the gender bias, but at least you don't have the race issue to deal with. And in fact, if you are overseas educated, it is still largely considered a good thing, right? So, I mean, unless you're going to some like, really, really like crappy university or something. But overall, if you're like, oh yeah, like I came from, Berkeley or whatever, people are like, that's plus points, right? Still going to be up to your individual ability, but everyone is open to considering you as a talent. Yeah,
I'd love to just ask you maybe one more question about your podcast.
sure. Yeah.
So, so I'm actually seeing the rise of a number of other in between Chinese diaspora centric podcasts lately.
Mm-hmm.
To me, this is a sign of increasing interest in cross border and cross cultural understanding. So, obviously, you have a podcast of this nature. And so, how do you think you have benefited from running this podcast, and how has it bridged gaps between the two worlds? And what are your plans for your podcast in the future?
I started doing it and I was like, oh, this is kind of cool because I really like learning about stuff. And there is learning about stuff, and there is the level of understanding you need to have to explain something to someone else, right? So because Tech Buzz is really primarily about explaining a company or sometimes a sector to our listeners, and trying to figure out, what gaps I need to fill in their understanding, that it actually makes me have to do a lot more research than I normally would. Even like if I did like when I was doing startup investing and I wanted to find like competitors and stuff, I wouldn't read like that much into the founder's story and who their friends were and like why this feature got made, I would, so like you're smiling, you can tell, right? So basically like, yeah,
Yeah,
coming
yeah,
from
yeah.
investment background, you do obviously due diligence, but you do a different kind of diligence, and you really don't get that deep necessarily. I mean, I wasn't doing hedge funds or anything. Hedge funds are different. You really need to know that company really well. But like, the podcast made me realize I actually really like doing this kind of I'm calling it diligence, but it's just research on the company. And I would often joke to my husband that I thought I knew China tech. And I did, right? In a sense that I worked in it for so many years in China, and like every interaction was tech pretty much. But I think I actually understand it better now that I'm forced to explain it to people. Yeah, because sometimes you're in
Right.
the weeds and you just like lose sight of the forest that you're in. And TechBuzz has helped me to gain that perspective. So in that sense, our future goals, I mean, I don't know if I was trying to get even deeper into, ByteDance, the company, by writing something on it. But other than that, I think there's enough positive audience feedback that will probably continue the current format for at least a little bit more. And as more and more tensions arise, maybe there's more of a market for people like us doing sort of the translation between the two markets as barriers are erected. But I don't try to predict the future, so I leave it pretty flexible.
Okay. Well, earlier you mentioned about this trip where you escorted American investors to
Yeah.
Chinese companies. I assume these are big Chinese companies.
Yeah.
What
Hmm.
is did that opportunity arise out of you doing podcast, or was that something
Yeah.
else?
Yeah. Yeah. To be frank, like I did the podcast as a hobby,
Yeah.
and I was trying to get some other products off the ground, not related to China tech at all.
Right.
And the opportunity came about because we have a lot of public market listeners actually. So a few wrote in and were like, we want to go to China. Our friends have been to China. We think you'd be the best to take us there. And then I was like,
Got it.
well, what do you mean? I'm not like a tour guide. I don't want to take you to China. And they were like, oh yeah, we only want to see tech companies and et cetera, et cetera. And then I was like, oh, this is really interesting because,
Yeah.
I know a lot of these companies, but I haven't made such formal visits to them either. So it was like an opportunity for me to learn as well, right? It'd be like, I might know some of your VPs and like talk to them as friends, but I don't know what you tell investors. Like, like what is your actual story? I've never been on your earnings calls. So that was a really interesting experience for me, but that's how it came about. It was very organic. We actually capped it at 12, and then just like too many people wanted to join that we ended up taking 15 investors, all full-time investors from, I think it was 6 different countries. So it wasn't all US because we have listeners globally um, to China. And then we curated the list of companies. So I pretty much took what they told me sectors they liked, but then I also put in a few companies I was curious about. So
Right. 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 Wow. Sounds great. Wow. Okay, great. Well, Ray, it's been great talking to you. Like you talked about your newsletter, right?
Mhm.
Like maybe share it with our listeners as to what these resources are, how to find you and all that.
Oh yeah, sure. So you can go to techbuzzchina.com to find everything I'm working on. The newsletter is still an experiment. We only have a couple hundred subscribers, but it's right now I've priced it at like $2 a month, where I basically write twice a month on something in depth about China tech that I hope is a different take from what you read in the media. I mean, that's the idea behind Tech Buzz anyway, but in the newsletter, I try to have more of a personal opinion than in Tech Buzz, where a lot of it is research driven and I'm telling you the facts. Whereas the newsletter tends to be more opinion. So something happened and then I'm reacting to it and trying to give you a different way of thinking about it. So the last one I wrote was I titled it How I'm Thinking About TikTok and WeChat Ban, because I felt that there were like some details that were missing from people's assessments of the ban. And so I wanted to get it out there.
Got it. Got it. Well, Ray, it's been great having you on Chinatown 2.0. And I
Yeah.
hope you come back again and talk about some other new exciting development.
So
Right.
thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
All right. Bye, Ray.
Bye.
Okay.
Thanks, Richard. Bye.